Pornography and adult content have a sordid reputation in modern society. Most scholarly work from the 20th century presents adult content as a vice, and the consumption of that vice leads to massive increases in crime and sexual violence. It's hard to find a study before the 1990s that doesn't come to this conclusion in one way or another. Consuming porn will make you a mentally ill sexual criminal. Then, most of the world got access to almost limitless pornography in the 1990s, and as opposed to a rise in sexual crimes, we see the greatest drop in sexual crime in recorded history. Yes, there are a lot of reasons suggested for this drop, but if the consumption of adult content truly caused an increase in crime and sexual violence, we would have never seen this kind of drop across the world. The drop is so extreme that governments and agencies across the world actually changed the definitions of sexual violence in the 2010s, which is great. However, if I'm counting apples and then start counting apples and oranges and bananas, that may be more useful information, but it's not the same data. Even after we get the spike from more comprehensive sexual assault definitions, the rate of decline is still the same. And if you want to compare the different data from the 90s and today, there is still around an 8% overall drop in sexual violence across the world. However, the real number is more like an 80% drop. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have more robust definitions of sexual violence. I am saying that it is disingenuous and irresponsible to treat the data like it's the same after you change the terms. So even by the most mathematically challenged and conservative estimates, worldwide sexual crime dropped as the world got virtually unfettered access to adult content via the internet. This clearly showed that there was a disconnect between the traditional perception of the impact of the consumption of adult content and the reality of the data. And it makes sense. If we see something as a vice, then we are not expecting it to have a positive impact on society. But what does adult content actually do? Increasingly, it gives people a safer way to explore their sexuality, their sexual preferences, and for some, even gives them a way to explore their gender identity. This is actually similar to the situation in video games with regards to aggression and violence. Early studies from individuals like Craig A. Anderson and Brad J. Bushman claimed that violent video games made players more aggressive. Unfortunately, there were real concerns in a lot of the data, the biggest probably being not adequately controlling for competition. A competitive activity, video game or not, is going to increase aggression more than a non-competitive activity. So a more competitive video game is going to show a greater increase in aggression than a less competitive game, regardless of violence in the game. I'm not sure if this was an issue of not understanding the video games being tested or a case of acting in bad faith, knowingly or not. Much ado about nothing, the misestimation and overinterpretation of violent video game effects in Eastern and Western nations comment on Anderson does a great job calling out this kind of material. Unfortunately, refuting a claim rarely gets the same attention as making a claim. It turns out that when you compare two games like The Sims 3 and Grand Theft Auto 5 and control for aggression differences in age and gender, there is no measurable increase in aggression from playing violent video games. Unfortunately, showing a null hypothesis. The evidence in favor of the null hypothesis based on the Bayes factor is not massive, but clearly above 1. Some of the harmonic means are above 1.6 and constitute substantial evidence. However, the harmonic mean has been criticized as unstable, owing to the fact that the sum is dominated by occasional small terms. In the likelihood, one may underestimate the actual evidence in favor of the null hypothesis. Doesn't get the same attention as saying, indeed, this effect of violent video games on aggression is as strong as the effect of condom use on risk of HIV infection. Even when you include the bad research, the harm of video games seems to be more of a researcher bias issue than an actual measurable outcome. Overall, results from 101 studies suggest that video game influences on increased aggression, reduced pro-social behavior, reduced academic performance, depressive symptoms, and attention deficit symptoms are minimal. Issues related to researchers' degrees of freedom and citation bias also continue to be common problems for the field. Publication bias remains a problem for studies of aggression. Recommendations are given on how research may be improved and how the psychological community should address video games from a public health perspective. So, the video game industry is stuck with this label that violent games are bad, when there is compelling evidence that the outlet provided by violent video games is reducing real-life violence. Namely, as VVGs have become more popular in the United States and elsewhere, violent crime rates among youths and adults in the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Japan, and most other industrialized nations have plummeted to lows not seen since the 1960s. And that's what we're talking about here. Outlets for aggression, outlets for desire, outlets to explore who and what we are from the safety of our homes. Video games are one of the greatest and most accessible ways to give people those outlets. It's no wonder that adult games currently represent one of the fastest growing segments of the video game industry. And almost everyone is consuming adult content. There is a perceived gap between the adult content consumption between men and women. However, this gap seems to be created by a confusion over how we define adult content. Women are more likely to consume written works when it comes to adult content. So, when you include things like erotica to the definition of adult content, the numbers come much closer to parity with men at 98.9% and women at 91.9%. While I have yet to see a study that includes steamy romance novels, it is likely we'd reach ever greater parity if we were to classify those as adult content as well. One of the hardest parts about researching sexual preferences and desires, what I like to call flavors, is that there is a strong likelihood of response bias with participants, especially social desirability bias. Social desirability bias is the tendency to underreport socially undesirable attitudes and behaviors and to overreport more desirable attributes. Take rape fantasies. Studies show that most heterosexual women have rape fantasies, and they are more likely to have them than heterosexual men. Is this number higher with women because it is more socially acceptable for a woman to say they have a rape fantasy than it is for a man to say they have a rape fantasy? It is reasonable to expect that most people are going to modify their answers to some degree to reflect this social desirability bias. In Taboo or Temptation, the desire that dares not to speak, exploring the enigmatic word of perception of fetishism in Pakistan, 89% of respondents said that they believe such behaviors are morally questionable, and that they think religion prohibits such deeds. And yet, 72% said that exploring new forms of pleasure improved their relationship, and 89% said that trying new things enhances relationships. Once again, we see a disconnect, this time between what people see as societal expectation of what is acceptable with regards to flavors versus their own personal desires and benefits. The good news is that younger generations are becoming more willing to be open about who they are and what they like. There is still a long way to go, and that is one of the biggest areas that adult content video games can help with. Video games give us an incredible way to explore and interact with fiction. Visual novels have emerged as a halfway point between books and games, with the otome market exceeding $5 billion in 2024. I'm not sure how sexual an otome game has to become before it counts as adult content, but most of them definitely count as exploring sex and sexuality. And how we classify things really matters when it comes to sex and sexuality. There is so much shame and judgment and psychological distress surrounding this topic that it can result in real harm. Like, there's this concept of vanilla, some baseline sexuality or sexual activity that is normal. Everything that deviates from that norm being classified as, well, deviant, a fetish, non-normative desire, strange. But what is actually vanilla then? The data shows that men and women tend to like different things. And of course, what is a normal desire for a heterosexual man is going to be different than what is a normal desire for a homosexual man. Then you have to factor in culture, age, what each of us is exposed to during our most formative years in adolescence and pre-adolescence. So yes, you can create a template for vanilla if you make your box specific enough, but even then, the desires of every single human will still never fit into it. Every single one of us has desires and preferences that are unique to our own lived experiences that, just like with the participants of the Pakistani study, puts us at odds with what we think society approves of. Take photophilia, the sexual interest in feet. This was once considered to be a preference of homosexual men. However, almost half the people who admit to having fetishes list this as a preference. And these are studies with a bias towards European and American preferences. It is quite probable, once you factor in the rest of the world and account for social desirability bias, that most heterosexual men may, in fact, find women's feet attractive. If the majority of heterosexual men actually end up liking a thing, why do we classify it as non-normative? How many hundreds of millions of men grow up thinking that their attraction to feet is abnormal or shameful? How has that distress negatively impacted their mental health and resulted in an adverse effect on society? Giving every human a safe and healthy outlet for their sexual desires should be seen as a public health standard. Unfortunately, we're still a long way from that. And that's where fictional content is filling that gap. In 2013, almost 1/3 of self-published works were erotic. Over 2,000 adult content games were released on Steam in 2024, and there are almost 9,000 adult game creators currently on Patreon. Now, I can't tell you how many of these adult content games prominently include bare feet in some type of sexual context, but it is safe to assume it is a lot of them. The developers that seem to have met the most success are the ones who have made games that reflect their desires and lived experiences. So, yeah, there is a lot of cis male heteronormative harem power fantasies. However, many of these games have optional gender fluid and homosexual content, which provide a potential gateway for exploration. There are many people who identify one way, who are exploring different aspects of their sexuality and identity, who may have never done so without the optional experiences provided by these types of games. And that's awesome. So we're currently seeing a bias in the adult game space similar to the video game market of the 1980s, with around 80% of adult gamers being men. It is likely that number will move to a more equal balance as the industry continues to grow and we see more games created for a female market. As it currently stands, most yaoi games, a branch of otome games that feature homosexual men, are consumed by women. And we are seeing more explicit versions of this genre emerge on Steam as the overall adult game space continues to grow. So, where does that place you all as game creators? Giving people ways to safely explore sex and sexuality through video games not only benefits society, but you can also make a lot of money. So, what's the problem? Just as there are many people who truly believe violent video games are detrimental to society, there are even more people who are absolutely certain that adult content makes the world worse. Places like Australia, Texas, and China have highly amorphous laws that make no distinction between real and fictional content. Visa and MasterCard consider adult content video games to be human trafficking adjacent and have aggressively regulated content on platforms like Patreon and seem to currently be at war with Japan over this. There's also a new wave of qualitative studies attacking adult content. While the data is very clear that consuming adult content does not cause sexual aggression, that doesn't stop people from continuing to say that it does, using new terms while still citing the same arguments from the 1980s. So, while you can make games that help people explore their sex and sexuality, help make society safer and healthier, and make money while doing so, all you have to worry about is being arrested, having your income taken away from you, and being labeled as a monster. The saddest part of all of this is that I truly believe that the people in China and Australia and Germany think they are acting to make the world safer, when all they are actually doing is harming mental health and making the world a much less safe place, especially for women. The more adults who are given outlets to safely explore their sex and sexuality, the better off society becomes, the healthier society becomes, the safer society becomes. This is one of those few times in history when you can actually do something that directly benefits society and make money while doing so. So, if you are willing to take the risk, make a game that explores sex and sexuality in a way you want to explore it. Right now, the adult games industry desperately needs talented game developers. The space is exploding, and the games are mostly being made by self-taught individuals who are just looking to tell their stories. And there is so much more room for so many more people to share their stories. I mean, yes, a text-based transformation game focusing on gender identity and corruption is probably not going to sell as many copies as a mostly heteronormative farming game with sex in it. But if you make a fun game with the flavors you like in it, then there will be an audience willing to pay to play it. Now, I know that some of you may have concerns about consent in adult games. I get where you're coming from. While it is kind of ridiculous that we want to talk about consent in a game with sex, but we don't ask if people are consenting to being murdered in Call of Duty. I look at it this way. Consent in fiction is between the person who creates the fiction and the person who consumes the fiction. I don't care if it is a book or a movie or a video game. As long as the creator consents to creating the work and the person who consumes the work consents to consuming the work, then anything that happens in the work is just an elaborate role play, regardless of how distasteful you or I may find that role play. Now, if actual people are harmed in the making of the fiction, then that's a problem. But if you want to write a book or make a game and someone else wants to buy it and no one else is harmed, then that is all of the consent that we should be talking about. Anything else is basically book burning with extra steps. And if you decide to make an adult content game, you are going to get people who are disgusted by whatever flavors you use in the game. And that's totally normal. Just as every person has different likes, we also all have different sexual disgust responses. While the strongest disgust responses tend to involve homosexual and heterosexual sex, a person can have a disgust response to just about any flavor. Sexual disgust is an understudied emotion of great importance from an evolutionary perspective. Previous research suggests there is interesting individual variation in the activation of this emotion. To understand how individual variation in sexual disgust sensitivity can persist under the winnowing forces of sexual selection, we must consider the role of context and personality dimensions in the conceptualization of sexual disgust. So it is totally fine if a flavor grosses you out. It's not just fine, it's normal and healthy. However, if you choose to use your disgust as justification to deny other people the safe and healthy way to explore that flavor, then there is a problem. Of course, any society is going to come together and decide what is and is not acceptable. For better or worse, that's just what societies do. However, if we want to try to be a part of a more perfect society, then we should have open conversations about what the actual impact of adult content is. Not just what we think it is, because that's what everyone else thought 100 years ago. So, make the game that you want to make that reflects your personal desires. The authenticity of that combination of flavors will resonate with your audience way more than just trying to combine what you think most people would or should like. There was a study that came out last year that showed that men and women were more likely to pick conventionally attractive characters. That doesn't mean that you can't make a game without conventionally attractive characters, just that a game that does will appeal to more people. You don't have to appeal to more people. If you want to make a xenomorph-inspired infestation breeding game that is going to appeal to fewer people than something like Star Trek or Mass Effect, where all of the romanceable aliens all look pretty much like humans. However, there is a very passionate base of people that really like xenomorph-inspired infestation breeding games. Think about how popular furry content is. There are not that many furry fans, but they tend to be incredibly loyal and willing to fund the projects that meet their flavor desires. Carnal Instinct and Wildlife are two multi-million-dollar Patreon-funded projects. One is now early access on Steam, and the other has multiple playable tech demos. Personally, I think that the furry numbers, like every other flavor, are probably underestimated. There are way too many commercially successful furry projects otherwise. And every flavor seems to be significantly more popular than the research currently shows. Are they as popular as feet for men and rape for women? I have no idea. But the only way we are going to find out is if we all get way more comfortable talking about this kind of stuff. And you know what creates conversation? Video games. Right now is an amazing opportunity for experienced developers. As opposed to making another cozy farming game in a sea of cozy farming games, you can make a cozy farming game with sex and immediately stand out. Still want to appeal to a mainstream audience? Make a patch that adds sexual content. Don't feel like you have to make your game more or less explicit than you want. A Summer's End, Hong Kong, 1986 is a fantastic journey and exploration of a woman's sexual identity. And it has no penetrative sex in it. He Fucked the Girl Out of Me is a semi-autobiographical visual novel about a transgender woman engaged in sex work and makes no attempt to be what most people would consider sexy. That's not what the game is about. An adult content game is about exploring sex and sexuality in some form. That form that it takes is up to you as the creator. In the future, I hope that sex and romance are as intertwined in video games as RPG mechanics. Baldur's Gate 3 did an amazing job of this, and for many people was their first experience with a video game that allowed them to explore sex and sexuality. How many men had their first homosexual awakening with Astarion? How many new furry fans were created by Hausen? I can't tell you what to make, and I can't tell you if it will be safe to make it. But we need more games that help people explore sex, sexuality, and identity. We need more games that help people understand that their desires and fantasies are normal and that they are not alone. How many of the 8 billion people on this entire planet have gone through their whole life and have never felt comfortable sharing who they are and what they like with another human because they were afraid that they wouldn't be seen as normal? How many people have never been able to even come to terms with who they are and what they like with themselves? Denmark is one of the most socially permissive countries in the world. Because of that, many of you all have a better opportunity to provide an outlet for the millions and billions of people on the planet who need the safe and healthy outlet that adult content video games can provide. And it is the societies that are the most restrictive that probably need these outlets the most. Taiwan has emerged as one of the new nexuses of adult content development, mainly because of the demand from mainland China. As I mentioned before, it is illegal to make adult content games in the PRC, but that sure isn't stopping Chinese people from playing them there. Sexual desire exists in almost all of us, regardless of our politics or faith or anything else that may otherwise divide us. The acceptance and proliferation of adult content games can help make us all more tolerant and understanding of other people's likes, desires, and identities. I mean, it's no magic bullet. There are still going to be people who only accept what they like and will remove anything that they are disgusted by. But by giving people safe and healthy outlets to explore sex and sexuality, there will end up being fewer of that kind of person. It's up to you what you want to take from this. I'd love it if some of you went on to make games that explored sex and sexuality, but what I'd really love to see is more people think about what they take for granted as truth and ask themselves if there is actually evidence to support that truth. I think that fundamental questioning is the basis for the gradual advancement of our species. Thank you so much to Nordic Game Jam for having me, and thank you so much to Matt for personally inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all, even if it is all the way from Vietnam. I have left some time for questions because though this is such a boring and non-controversial topic, I thought you all may have a few.